So thank you everyone for coming. I want to first introduce our moderator, Helen Chapman. Helen's dedication to improving and serving the community spans decades. I'm sure most of you know Helen. She has served on the board for Green Foothills, San Jose Parks Commission, and co-founded the San Jose Parks Foundation. Currently, she is a director for the Santa Clara Valley Open Space Authority for Area 3, serves as secretary of the Lincoln High School Foundation Board, and is president of Shasta Hanchett Park Neighborhood. She was just recently recognized as one of the 2020 Women of Influence by the San Jose Business Journal and was also named Assembly District 28 Woman of the Year in 2017. Helen is the secretary for the Santa Clara County Democratic Central Committee and elected delegate for Assembly District 28, as well as a member of DAWN and the Silicon Valley Democratic Club. She works as a policy and legislative advisor for Councilman Sergio Jimenez at District 2 and specializes in housing and environmental policy. So thank you, Helen, for agreeing to moderate tonight, and I'll hand it over to you.
Right. Thank you, Jenny. It's a pleasure to be here. And I keep seeing people come. So, hopefully we'll we'll draw a bigger crowd because I'm a policy wonk, so I think this is going to be a fascinating conversation. So anyway, again, thank you for inviting me. It's fun. All right. So my job now is to introduce Brendon, and I don't want to miss your name, but it's a Stracener.
You nailed it. That's perfect.
Hey,
yeah.
All right. As a staffer, usually we have things like phonetically spelled out sometimes, so I took a chance. All right, great. So Brendon Stracener is a senior research fellow for the California Constitution Center at UC Berkeley School of Law. He writes on constitutional issues, especially issues involving the California Constitution and California courts. Brendon has also published on issues involving the U.S. Constitution and attempts at constitutional reform in Iceland. Wow. Brendon is sometimes a lecturer at Berkeley Law and advanced legal writing, as an attorney in private practice. Part of his passion for constitutional law in the courts derives from clerking for the Honorable Kimberly J. Mueller, District Judge at U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of California, and the Honorable Lucy H. Coe, District Judge at the U.S. District Court for Northern District of California. While in law school, he interned for the Honorable Consuelo Maria Callahan, Circuit Judge at U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, and the Honorable Mariano Florentino Pilar, Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of California. These experiences sparked Brendon's interest in the approaches of different court systems, different underlying foundational law. His law school work includes leading a student team comprising of Berkeley Law, UC Davis Law students, and revising California's Political Reform Act. Brendon received his JD from the University of California, Berkeley School of Law, and his BA in philosophy from the University of California, Berkeley. Whew. Incredible credentials. Welcome, Brendon, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Hi, yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Are we introducing anyone else, or can I take it away from here?
You got it.
Okay, excellent. Well, hello, everyone. I'm sure the recall is an exciting thing. I've seen a lot of writing about it. I think there's been a recent piece in the Atlantic. It's not, it's something that historically has not happened often, which I'll get to. But one of the first things I think I wanted to touch on is where are we at in the current status of the recall, just to see where everyone is. There's a lot of working parts. There's about half a dozen or almost half a dozen steps before the recall is certified. So it's an cumbersome process that involves a lot of agencies. So we're currently at the stage where people have the opportunity to petition to pull their name off of the petition for the recall. So one of the procedural mechanisms we have is that sometimes voters sign petitions and don't entirely realize what the scope of them are or what's going on. In some cases here, perhaps there were voters who realized that perhaps, once they heard the cost of the recall or understand that the recall is going to be expensive and so close to a primary election for the same official that maybe it's not worth having anymore and maybe they don't want to sign on to it. So voters who sign the petition have until June 8th to request removal. And then from there, there's kind of a series of cascading deadlines that honestly, there's not really any mechanism if any agency or group blows the deadline. So that'll be interesting to see if anyone does. I don't think they will. Oftentimes they can complete them early, and that leaves a lot of uncertainty about when the recall will take place. But the counties have additional business days to report the number of recorded signatures, basically after they get back any voters who say, I don't want to be on it anymore. The Secretary of State then must promptly That's the statutory language. Determine if there are enough verified signatures remaining. From there, there's the Department of Finance, the Joint Legislative Budget Committee, each get about 30 business days to do what they need to do to kind of look at the cost of the election, to comment on the recall, and then eventually from there it's certified, and the Lieutenant Governor has to set the recall within 60 to 80 days, which is a 20-day window. And I'll touch on what that kind of means in terms of her discretion and how that relates to some of the other processes. But as you can see, there's a lot of processes going on, a lot of moving parts, and we've had the estimates. I think the current estimates are putting the recall at around October, but it could be later and it could be earlier, depending on which agencies move quickly and which agencies do not move quickly. So one of the key things that I've explored or we've looked at is there's an interesting amount of discretion that both the Secretary of State and the Lieutenant Governor have in determining the process for the recall. And I think the most interesting piece, at least to me, is the Secretary of State's level of discretion. So there's a requirement that recall elections are conducted in substantially the same manner provided by law for a regular election of the office. And that substantially is a key word there. There's a lot of discretion in that. Historically, Secretaries of State, I think, have chosen the safest, maximal democracy option, which is 65 signatures and a $3,500 fee. And that's the equivalent of the primary, if you're a party candidate process, if you're a member of a political party, that's the requirement to get onto a primary ballot for your political party. So Secretaries of State have historically used that. And as you can imagine, 65 signatures is not that hard to get compared to a lot of other signature gathering requirements. It's a cakewalk, right? Like, can you find 65 people to sign off on you who are a member of your political party and pay the $3,500 fee? And so, not surprisingly, that was the process. For those of you who recall, 2003, there was the recall election with Governor Gray Davis. And sorry, my dog is playing with a squeaky toy, so you probably can hear that. The advantages of a home office are many, but the dog is. I keep my dog out. So. Yeah. So yeah, basically, in 2003, we had this process used. The Secretary of State chose that process, and that amounted to, I believe, around 135 candidates. And most of them were not serious candidates, right? I mean, so it ran the full gamut, right? So I've written separately, not in my capacity as a research fellow of the California Constitution Center, but I've written in reference to that as a clown car of candidates. Of course, some of them were serious, but most of them were not. And so that creates a naturally nightmarish ballot. Do voters really want to trudge through that? Is there a concern about, can we choose a procedure, given the Secretary of State's discretion, that perhaps, looks for serious candidates to get in, and it doesn't gatekeep too hard, that favors democracy, but also does not, at the same time, allow just non-serious candidates to kind of pile in, just for, I guess, the vanity of being on a ballot. So there was a challenge to the 2003 process. It was a case of Burton versus Shelley that kind of laid out some different options the Secretary of State might have had. That challenge was basically the challenge we're talking about now, which is, the challengers there said, look, this 65 signature process is bananas. You need to use the independent candidate process. And the independent candidate process requires 1% of all registered voters. At that time, it was around 153,000 signatures, I think. And today, I think that would be around 220,000. So that's quite a bit more, right? That's pretty onerous. I think you need to be a pretty serious candidate to get that number of signatures. And it's not impossible, but that's a night and day between that and 65.
More credibility to the election, yes. Right,
yeah. So if you can gather 220,000 signatures, I'd see it needing to be on the ballot. 65 is a bit of a difference. So, and not surprisingly, I think the Secretary of State chose, I would call it probably the safe option, right? I think whenever we're looking at direct democracy tools, including the recall, including initiative, including referendum, I think there's a resistance or a hesitation, understandably, from courts, from the legislature, from the governor to do anything that is anti-democratic, right? That's always a hesitation and a concern. So his Secretary of State chose the historical process. Now, mind you, it was ahistorical in terms of it being for the governor, but for other recalls, the Secretary of State had chosen this simple process, which I'm sure can work fine for local elections or other types of recalls that are on a smaller scale. Fortunately, the court said, look, the Secretary of State has the discretion to choose what they want, right? It just has to be substantially the same manner. Secretary of State can do what they choose. They chose this. We're not going to question it. And I think the court's reasoning made sense there. But there were some interesting positions there. The Chief Justice had a rejected kind of middle ground position that said that would have amounted to about 74,000 signatures, looking at kind of the historical precedents and the background of how the recall developed over time. Understandably, I think California's history is a very long, messy history of popular ideas through direct democracy and then trying to figure out where they fit in the Constitution and then kind of adjusting them repeatedly. And then you've stacked several propositions onto each other and you have to clean them up. So the Chief Justice kind of trudged through that and said, look, let's do this. I think Secretary of State should do a 74,000 kind of middle ground position. That's not as crazy as the independent candidate process, but it has some teeth to it, right? It's more than 65 total signatures. Unfortunately, I guess the Chief Justice did not get any, did not gain any traction on that. And that 2003 process was upheld as a safe process. So, I don't have a magic crystal ball here, but to the extent I did, I wouldn't be surprised if the Secretary of State here looks to the safe process that the California Supreme Court has upheld and sticks with the 65 signature process. I think there are some who would say, you have the discretion to choose something else and you'd be protected, but it's pretty easy when considering a court challenge to say, well, the court's upheld that before, so I'm just going to do that again. That discretion also kind of plays with the lieutenant governor's decision of when to set the recall election. So the lieutenant governor, once everything's certified, has about 60 to 80 days. And what she does with that, could result in, it basically results in potential candidates either having 1 or about 19 days to gather the signatures they need. So there is some consideration, for the lieutenant governor looking at what the Secretary of State chooses. So if the Secretary of State decides to do the independent candidate process and require 221,000 signatures, I would hazard a guess the lieutenant governor is probably not going to give candidates only 1 day to gather that many signatures.
Yeah.
And that could create this crazy scenario where there's nobody qualifies. And if nobody qualifies, by the way, the statutes provide for, the winner, hypothetically, if the governor were recalled, would be whoever had the most write-in signatures, which would be bananas. It would be interesting, but I don't know if I'm very risk averse. So I don't know if I'd want to play that game of chance. But so I think the lieutenant governor has some discretion to kind of scale or respond to how the Secretary of State chooses procedures. I will say my awareness of the lieutenant governor's public comments is that first and foremost, she's thinking about whatever's most convenient for the voters. I think she's assuming she'll probably put it on a Tuesday from what I've seen, although there's no requirement to do that. And my guess is she would probably look to avoid any holidays or any things that voters would hate, right? So she's only really got a 20-day window at the end of the day. Let's do something that voters don't hate and voters can get to the polls or reliably vote on, and again, maximize democracy. But to the extent there's room for her to exercise discretion to consider how big that window is, that's something worth considering. The 2003 recall had about a 16-day window to qualify. And again, we got 135 very non-serious candidates. So looking at that precedent could be something to think about. And then, I guess, just to give some other background, I think, on the recall and, where it's come historically, what it looks like, what some of the commentary I've seen has been for us to consider. The recall is not, for the governor, is not a very common thing. It's not a common thing generally, actually. Since 1913, there have been 179 attempts to recall state officials, and only 10 of those 179 qualified for the ballot. Only 6 were successful. Specifically, the governor, 55 attempts, and 2 have now made it to the ballot. One of those was successful, and one, we're waiting to see. So, despite, concern, perhaps some have voiced concerns about the recall being a kind of like easy to qualify or too easy to do, or having too low of a signature requirement. That could be something to look at in the future and see how that proceeds. But historically, the success rate of it qualifying for the ballot is very low. And that's despite numerous attempts, right? So as far as Governor Newsom is concerned, this is, I believe, the 6th recall attempt. And the 5 previous ones fizzled. This is pretty typical, I think, for many governors. There are repeated attempts to recall each of them, and most of them peter out. There is some argument, perhaps, that the 120-day extension that the petitioners received this time around was enough to give them the time to gather enough signatures that perhaps wouldn't have happened. Although, counter arguments to that are that coronavirus is a unique historical event.
I think that played a significant role this time.
Yeah, it did for several reasons, right? So both in favor of being able to gather signatures and perhaps some of the difficulties that were initially faced that, perhaps justified or at least provided a rationale to obtain a 120-day extension on what's normally a 160-day window to gather the signatures. So, so another thing I'll note too, in terms of, what makes, in terms of the recall, how serious it needs to be, there is a significant cost for this. You can do grassroots efforts as much as you want, but you often need professional signature gathering companies, and those signatures run at about $2 to $3 per signature. Just to pay someone to basically stand, outside a grocery store or wherever they post up and to get those signatures, right? So if you scale that, replacement candidates today could face a cost of $442,000 to $663,000 to get qualified if there's a more substantial signature requirement than the 65 signatures. So there's something to think about is, how much does money play into that, and how much do we want it to affect it? Is it a reasonable thing to require or not? And it's just something else that adds to the dimension of the recall candidates who are qualifying, but then also why perhaps previous recall efforts historically have all fizzled. So I got, and just to give some clarity basically on the recall requirements. The requirements that some have argued are low is that it requires 12% of voters who voted in the last election for the office. And that is one of the lowest. Montana's is a little bit lower at 10%, but I think the way some of the details of that shake out are that, oh, come here, buddy. You're just gonna hang out with us. Hello, this is my dog, everyone. So he's gonna hang out. Yeah, he's jealous. So the moment I start talking to anybody other than him, he wants attention. So with the recall, California does have a little bit of a lower threshold than most other states. Many states have about a 25% signature requirement. And there is an argument, I've seen the argument from some, that perhaps this 12% is too low. I'm not so certain about that. Again, that could be something to look at toward the future if historically we see in an increasingly polarized political environment, repeated qualified recall efforts. That might be something the voters want to revisit. I think at the same time, historically, the voters in California do not vote to strip themselves of political power. So, and I understand why. We love our direct democracy tools, as flawed as they may be, or as many times as we may not like how they work out in a particular instance. I would suspect voters would be wary of the idea of making the recall harder to qualify for. But there are arguments when comparing to other states that maybe the threshold should be a little bit higher. And I think I would, I tend to be the one to say, there's no need to panic, and let's see how this plays out. And if we look at history looking backwards, I don't think the 12% is a concern. And I also note that's a higher threshold than it takes to qualify an initiative statute or to qualify an initiative constitutional amendment. You need only 5% for statutes and 8% for initiative amendments. So it's actually a lower threshold to modify the state constitution than it is to qualify someone for the recall. So I think when you're comparing it holistically to other direct democracy tools, it's not that crazy low of a number. And I think overall that would probably speak a little bit, to the message or the thoughts here, perhaps, about direct democracy. There are plenty of people celebrating it at different times and complaining about it at others. I'll admit, I'll admit, looking at proposition measures, sometimes I'm like, should I be deciding this? I'm really trying to educate myself here, and I am not a policy expert in this field, and God forbid I choose the wrong thing, right? But I think historically voters, are smart in that sense, and if they can't understand or have a problem with something, then they'll probably vote no on it and force, other legislative tools to come into play to kind of get that legislation, that policy across the finish line. Other things I would say that kind of maybe ward off concerns about direct democracy is just circling back to the mention of cost. You do have to put forward quite a bit of money to gather signatures to, qualify a recall, to qualify an initiative. So it's something that I think helps kind of gatekeep a little bit. Although the concern of that, I think, is perhaps that has inverted the historical basis for the recall. The recall, as you may know, came about in 1911 with Governor Hiram Johnson. He pushed through those reforms, and that was to basically take political power back from the railroad barons, who had basically had the legislature in their pocket. So there are interesting questions today too of if it costs a significant amount of money, a few $1 million, realistically speaking, to get an initiative qualified or to get a recall qualified for the ballot. Does that mean, money to interests? Money to interests, are back in play or are a concern for, control of the initiative process. One counterpoint to that might be that voters, I think, can sniff that out. I think, for better or worse, whatever your position on the recent Proposition 23 in 2020, there was not exactly the same, but somewhat of a repeat from an initiative in 2018, only 2 years earlier, all of those dealing with dialysis clinic issues. And if you look at the statistics on that, in 2018, voters said no to it. It was perceived as, whether that was accurate or not, it was perceived as, I think, by those voting no, that, labor interests, who might have had legitimate interests at the bargaining table, were trying to kind of short circuit that negotiation and go to the voters, which they're allowed to do. And then in 2020, it got shot down by a larger margin. So I think voters do get fatigued, they get tired, they don't like to see the same issue over and over again. And I think, as applied to recalls, perhaps, if we see these repeatedly qualifying, I suspect voters more and more will be able to kind of suss out that this is ridiculous and quickly shoot it down. And then the only remaining question is, do we want to keep going through that process over and over?
Yeah.
And are there different things?
You brought up a really good point when you said, sometimes when you're looking at the proposition, should I be voting on this? Do the voters really understand what's written in there and what the intent and what the consequences are of that? Yeah.
Yeah, it's difficult. Yeah, I mean, when budgetary measures are hard too, sometimes we're very distrustful, I think, or Americans generally are, of politicians and what they do with our money. And at the same time, if we constantly budget by the ballot box, that kind of takes away legislative discretion to budget later. And then they can't form a budget because all the money's accounted for and there's no flexibility. But at the same time, we get to dictate how it's spent. So I think there are legitimate trade-offs to consider about, which initiatives we like and which ones are useful for us as voters and which ones we maybe would prefer the legislature to resolve, with policy analysts and experts on the subject matter.
Sure. Oh, thank you, Brandon. At this point, I think I'll open it up to questions, and I think we'll allow 1 minute for a question and 2 minutes for an answer. And we have a small enough group, so we probably can get quite a few questions asked. So I don't know how you guys want to do this. Somebody just want to, Jenny, you're going to do the unmute and mute. Okay, fire away. First question. No questions, you guys?
Sorry, I came in late. So what are, to sum it up in 2 minutes, what are we looking at? What are the chances?
Yeah, so, we are looking at, I think there's little doubt in anyone's mind at this point that the recall qualifies, that we will have a recall. My best guess is October, but the timing can vary significantly based on how slow or how quick some of the agencies involved at the back end of this process operate. I wouldn't be surprised if it's a very easy to qualify for ballot as a replacement candidate. So I would not be surprised if we do see a repeat of 2003 with 100 or more candidates who just want to be on the ballot because it's fun and easy to do. And my guess is, I could be wrong, but my guess is it seems like the political winds are were originally in Governor Newsom's favor and seems like they're getting more likely to be so. I think there's a lot of unknown variables, and if good favorable things happen with coronavirus, if the budget surplus plays to voters' interests and makes them feel better about the state of California and the state of their own lives, and I would suspect the governor's chances would only get better. Yeah, but that won't change the fact that we might be trudging through a lot of very non-serious candidates on the ballot in the recall sometime this fall.
Which is the more serious one so far?
Are you talking about candidates?
Oh,
Yeah, candidates.
yeah, I can answer that.
And the governor, yeah.
Yeah. So the way the recall works is there's two questions. The first question is, do you want to keep the current governor or not? Yes or no? And if the governor gets a majority of those votes, of those who vote staying, then great. The governor stays and we don't care about the second question. But if the governor doesn't get that majority, then it just goes to whoever gets the most votes in that pool of candidates. So you could get, 20% of the votes, but you have the most among the replacement options and you're that person. So it is a little bit interesting and crazy to think that perhaps you could have a situation where Governor Newsom gets 49.1% of the votes, yes, to keep him, and what is it, 50.9 if I'm doing math correctly, to reject him, and still have way more votes than whoever the replacement candidate who would succeed would be.
Yeah. I see Michelle's got her hand up.
Thanks, Brandon. That was really great summary of how the recall works and how the procedure works. You may have said this and I just missed it, but what's the deadline for replacement candidates to file?
So that will be scaled to when the lieutenant governor sets the election. So they'll have a 1 to 19-day window from when the election is certified to when the election takes place. So that's going to occur, sometime a little bit before the election. But basically, they'll get a certification. There'll be a form the Secretary of State issues, and basically everybody will take that and run to get signatures in a between 1 to 19-day period.
So based on what Eleni does, they might have as little as 1 day to.
Yes, I think that's highly unlikely, but yes, my guess is when she sets that election is probably going to be more focused on, am I running into any holidays that are going to upset people about having to vote around that time?
And I'm sure she's not, going to want to look like she's intentionally stacking the deck, just for her own political future, if for no other reason. And she's, of course, a very fair person anyway. So probably like 2-week period. Now, can they be out getting signatures now, or can they not even start getting the signatures until the period actually opens?
Yes, so my understanding with everybody who's looked at this, because it is not super clear, but in practice and the way it has worked in our understanding of the statutes, which again are admittedly not clear, is that you cannot start gathering signatures until it is certified. So basically it's a 1 to 19-day go, depending on when the lieutenant governor sets it. And I anticipate
people lined up ahead of time, obviously.
Oh yeah, for sure. If I only have to get 65 signatures, I probably have a Facebook group set up or whatever tool I want to use for social media and said, hey, you guys are ready to sign day one, right? Boom,
it's 65 signatures. That's all they
need. Yes, and a $3,500 filing fee.
Okay. And so far I'm just following on the prior question, but I haven't seen, just like an absolute clown car of lunatics so far. And so I haven't seen anybody, there's like the guy with the Kodiak bear and, I haven't seen anybody who's like credible yet. Are we expecting to see credible, good candidates come in at some point, or do you have any thought about that? Is there anybody who's just sort of out there and, waiting, or,
Yeah. So that's the interesting thing, right? The state Republican Party, I think, has their candidate chosen that they're already backing.
The guy with the bear?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay.
I don't know if anybody else has been voiced, but I believe that's John Cox, if I remember the name correctly, and someone else might remember. But as far as Democrats have gone, I think the initial perspective or strategy was, kind of rally around the governor and don't do what happened in 2003 with Lieutenant Governor Bustamante. And that's also Lieutenant Governor Kanalakis has said, I'm not putting my name in the hat. Absolutely not. Which helps, I think, lend a little bit of credibility to her involvement in the process. And then, of course, in California, something I always love to celebrate, our executives are independently elected. So the Secretary of State and the Lieutenant Governor do not serve at the pleasure of the governor, if you will. So their roles, they have a little bit of independent, independent directly voted in accountability to the voters, which I think is nice to see. So.
Bill, thank you.
Hi, Brandon. I have a question about the process. I think with the number of signatures and the extension this time, I think is something that came into play. But it's also that thing you referred to where the large number of candidates, pretty much the top vote getter, might get fewer votes than the governor gets and still be elected governor. And that would be, both kind of unfair and very unfortunate for the state in terms of that person being able to govern effectively. Is there any reform that would be practical that could avoid that as an outcome?
I think that's hard to say for a recall because, you probably want someone to get the majority of votes. I guess what you could do is you could set up a recall. I think these things are kind of tightly timed sometimes though. So that's the difficulty. But I guess one thing you could do is take the top 2 vote getters among the recall candidates and have a very quick, immediate, runoff to see who gets the majority between the two. And that might be the best way to do that to ensure at least the election results in a majority percentage elected candidate. It would be inelegant and require a little bit of delay to a process that I think probably needs to take place quickly if the voters want it to take place quickly. But I think that's one way to kind of ease that concern about this guy got how many votes and is now leading, the state, the state that it has, one of the largest top 5 economies in the world. So I think that would be my best off the cuff, I think, fix or tweak.
Wouldn't that require a constitutional amendment, though? Wouldn't any change to this process require a constitutional amendment?
Yes, yeah. So you're gonna need to get those signatures for 8% of voters and have your few $1 million in your, to round up signatures. So if someone, who has that kind of money wants to go on an ideological crusade, or there's someone who, has a moneyed interest who also thinks that this is a worthwhile thing to do, then, that could probably happen. So.
Okay, and we have a question in the chat. What does it take to win?
Oh yeah. So I think we covered. I think I might have covered that, but really quickly, because I think it is very important. So Governor Newsom will be a simple yes/no. If he gets 50% plus one, of the yes to keep him, he stays, and we don't care about the secondary answers or the secondary candidate options. If he gets fewer than 50%, he gets 49.9% to keep, then he's out. And whoever gets the most votes among the replacement candidates, no matter what that percentage is, whoever gets the most votes among the replacement candidates would be the new governor. And to be clear for anyone who's voting in this, you can vote for a replacement. If you vote yes to keep Governor Newsom, you can still vote for a replacement as kind of a just in case thought process. So do not feel like you only have to vote one option or both. You can answer both questions.
Okay. One other question. Polls are looking favorable for the governor. Theoretically, if he turns around, it looks likely he would lose. Could he resign and allow the lieutenant governor to take over, thereby keeping the office in the Democratic hands?
That's an interesting question. That might be possible. I have not considered that, but I would love the opportunity to. Now my academic interest is engaged. The idea of clever tactics always amused me. I'd be happy to send something to circulate around to the group on any thoughts on that. I think it is a possibility. But I imagine if things are looking really bad, I wouldn't be surprised if the Democratic Party sees the better or wiser option of perhaps going ahead and throwing in their own serious replacement candidate. It's not that hard to qualify. They're going to know what the window is. They can work with the Secretary of State and Lieutenant Governor, just get wind of when this is going to happen and say, okay, Newsom looks like he's going down. If that's going to happen, I think that's probably not. But if that changes, they can probably put up a replacement candidate pretty quickly and just, I think, directly win that way instead of doing something that maybe the voters are going to hate. So, I mean, I think it would look just really not, it looks like you're being very anti-democratic, right? So,
Brandon, that's a great segue into our next speaker, actually. It's going to be the call to action from the Santa Clara Democratic Party, right? What are we going to do if and when, or what, what's already being discussed, right? We just had the Democratic Party convention earlier this month, so it was definitely the subject of that convention. Anyway, thank you again for your time. I think we all found the information highly fascinating. I did. I mean, there's things that I didn't know, having lived through the 2003 election, but I really do appreciate the time that you take to be with us today. Thank you very much.
Yeah, anytime. And I'd love to hang around and listen to the next speaker too. This is I love doing this stuff. It's what drives me. So
you have to be a policy wonk. It's kind of fun.
Yes, stay, Brandon, because something may come up that you know the answer to.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I'd be happy.
I actually know the answer to the last question about what happens if he resigns, but I'll tell you after.
Oh yes. Okay, I'm sticking around for that. So thank you.
All right. Well, next, it is with great pleasure I get to introduce the chair of the Democratic Party, Bill James. Bill has been active in the local Democratic Party for more than 25 years. He's been chair for the past 4 years. He attended the U.S. Naval Academy and served in the Navy until 1991, including 2.5-year tour on a ship based in Yokosuka, Japan. His Navy service brought him to California, where he settled after leaving the service. Bill attended Stanford Law School and works as a patent lawyer. Bill and his wife met in law school. They lived together in Mexico City for an academic year under a Fulbright scholarship. He is the father of 3 teenagers. Welcome, Bill James.
Thank you very much, Helen. So it's great to be here tonight. Thank you for not reading the full overlong bio that I sent to Jenny earlier. I think that of all of that, obviously the thing that best qualifies me to be chair of the local Democratic Party is being the parent of teenagers. So that's really come in handy more than once. So I was asked to talk about some of the practical stuff. And then Jenny, did you get my slides? I'm going to ask Jenny to share my slides because she's the host and has that power. And I just want to look at a couple of the visuals about this campaign, because for a lot of us on the Democratic activist side, there's been some concern about how we've been talking about the campaign to date, but I think it's all going to be okay for reasons that I'll point out. Thank you very much. So this is my first slide. That's who I am. We can hop to the next one. And this is what I wanted to show. I picked this like black theme for this slideshow because there's so much darkness. There's so much darkness in the no on the recall campaigns imagery and words about this so far. You see stop the Republican recall, say no to the recall, and then there's a simple thing to sign up. This is on their campaign website, and a lot of us have been getting bombarded with emails that are saying, you know, maybe there's some endorsements that are probably good for the governor. There are some calls to action, and there's definitely calls for donation, but mostly it seems like the campaign and the governor's campaign are amassing the resources they'll need to run a statewide campaign. They seem to be assuming that they'll have to do that. A couple things about this. I took this snapshot from a slideshow on this site. It's the only picture of Gavin Newsom that you see. And if you look at the context here, you'll realize that some person holding the sign is holding a sign that says to recall Newsom. And they're trying to show that these are crazies. They've got like Blue Lives Matter signs and things like that. And that's the theme. It's basically the January 6th Capitol riot crowd trying to recall Governor Newsom. And there's some support for that in reality. A lot of the money came from the National Republican Party. A lot of the money came from people who also funded these groups that took over the Capitol on January 6th. But there's more to it to that, and that's what's been bad news for the governor and what we have to keep in mind as we pursue this campaign. The next slide, please. So here again, to stop the Republican recall, the current focus seems to be on getting us on their list and getting us to donate. They've also asked local Democratic parties to pass resolutions strongly condemning the recall, really mostly in these same terms as being a Republican thing. They've also quietly been getting local elected officials to endorse the no position. And I think that's a hedge against some, a more attractive candidate coming forward and trying to get some support in local communities. So they're trying to lock down all the things you'd want to lock down early in a campaign season. And if you're interested in getting on their list, you can go to stoptherepublicanrecall.com. I don't think it will do anything other than get you more bombarded with donation requests at the moment, though. There are some things on that website to sign up to text message, for example. And as a test, some of our activists have signed up on those lists, but they're not yet doing anything. So you'll be on their list. They'll probably reach out to you at some point or pass their list on to us at the local party to engage you. But right now there's not a lot going on, in part because of all the contingencies and uncertainty that Brendon was referring to earlier. And then the next slide. And then this is the brighter message we're starting to hear from the governor. The California roars back. He's going to have to fight John Cox for the roars thing, because John Cox has a lot invested in the overdrugged bear and wants to be using the California roaring back theme himself. But this is the governor's recent theme. And in the small print below that, you can see that it's backed up by Governor Newsom's $100 billion California comeback plan. And I think that the biggest news for Gavin Newsom by far, obviously, is the successful vaccination program and turning the corner on the pandemic and the likely economic impact of that. But one of the really convenient for the governor things that happened is that in his May revise of the budget, which is a part of the budget process that happens every year, he had about $75 billion of unexpected money to propose to allocate in certain ways that might be advantageous to his campaign. And the next slide. And the California comeback plan, here's some of the pieces. Is spending money on economic recovery. I think importantly in their messaging, they're focusing on individual payments, which are going out pretty broadly to Californians. Everybody will get a check. And in addition, some steps to support small businesses, because there were some criticisms early on in the pandemic that the harsh and strict closures without support for small businesses were really disadvantageous to small business. Addressing homelessness and housing, the access to housing. Homelessness is a huge problem in California. It's getting more and more attention as a primary concern among voters. So not surprisingly, one of the 5 things in the California comeback plan is the idea of addressing that. Transforming public schools into gateways for opportunity. That's their messaging and their turn of phrase. but there's some investment in schools, which that's money that will go into local communities and will satisfy voters and make people pleased with the governor. Investments in infrastructure are always good, whether they be small things like roads or big things like high-speed rail. I know that locally we had some project that was proposed, and local transit agencies and funding authorities were trying to figure out how to pay for them in pandemic times. But with money that came in from the federal government and this additional money that's available in the state budget, it looks like that project will be fully funded. And that, again, builds goodwill. And then combating wildfires and tackling climate change, not surprising, those are major concerns. Next slide. So I think the keys to victory for the governor, and I do think the governor will defeat the recall, and these are some of the keys to the victory. I think he's shown great leadership in the pandemic. There are some missteps, some very notable missteps, which are drawbacks for him. But in general, locking down and then easing up, maybe not with perfection in terms of the timing of last summer and some of the steps along the way, a little bit of bumpiness in getting the schools open. But in general, it was a protective posture that has resulted in California's experience being less miserable than a lot of states in the union and a lot of places on the earth. Accomplishments as governor. I think it's important to remember that the governor did a lot before the pandemic ever came around. The legislature was really productive in 2019. The governor signed a bunch of great things into law, including 2 years of cost-free education in community colleges for most students who enroll. Future priorities. I mark this as a key to victory and success for the governor because I think that California's priorities overwhelmingly align with Gavin Newsom's priorities. And so if he talks about those priorities in campaign mode, people will agree with him as they did in 2018. He was elected with over 60% of the vote. John Cox was a candidate at the same time. And I think that that hasn't changed fundamentally in California. Another key will be turnout of the vote. This will be a turnout election for Democrats. There likely won't be anything else on the ballot. We need to get people to vote no. We need to understand how to vote no and why it's important to do that. I think you're going to be helped by the fact that they'll likely be able to make voting by mail broadly available as they did during the earlier time in the pandemic in the 2020 election. And if we do an election that way, then as Democratic Party chair in Santa Clara County, I'm confident we'll be able to turn out the no on the recall votes that we need to turn out. Getting people to the polls on a given Tuesday, that might be more challenging. But if everybody gets a vote by mail ballot, I think we win this very handily. It's a nationalized election. This has already happened. And this is doubly bad for Gavin Newsom's opponents. On the one hand, he can tag the whole thing as a thing that has been funded by national interest. Trump can't help himself talking about it. I think that they're looking at taking Gavin Newsom down a notch, and instead, I think they're tossing a ball right up in a nice sweet spot for him to hit it out of the park. At the same time, the Republicans, who maybe might be thought to have the best chance of winning, are not quite, in good with Trump, and he can't help himself. So he's going to want to talk bad about Gavin Newsom, but he's not going to have very positive things to say about the candidates most possible to kind of really create an alternative to him, which are Cox and Kevin Faulconer, the former mayor of San Diego. So Cox's case, he voted for the Libertarian in 2016, then later said he regretted it, but never really did say whether he did vote for Trump or would vote for Trump. Faulconer has tagged himself as Trump because he said he voted for Trump in 2020 because of the economy. Now, of course, the economy is thriving under Biden, but the Trump himself has said that he doesn't consider Faulconer to be a very strong Trump guy. So I think that's going to work against the Republicans. And then finally, driverless clown car. We're really proud of our driverless car technology in California. In 2003, we had a clown car driven by Arnold Schwarzenegger and Gary Coleman, and they both tugging on the wheel, and Schwarzenegger won out and got elected. But this is our driverless clown car. I think you've got Caitlyn Jenner sucking in some of the oxygen. You've got John Cox running around on TV with an actual circus animal. So he's got some overdrugged bear, which, as Professor Darwood pointed out, is not even a California bear. And the whole thing is just a mess. And so I think Californians don't want to have our democracy seem like a ridiculous thing that's to be laughed at and mocked by others. And that aspect people will find to be distasteful this time. And I hoping it will cause them to vote no. And then the next slide. So these are big risk factors for Gavin Newsom. If you're running because you handled COVID well and you're counting on the economic recovery of post-COVID times, if the COVID comes back and the election has to be held like in a winter time, and all of a sudden there's a variant that starts to surge, then people are just going to feel malaise and concern. And I think that creates a wild card effect that might be harder for Newsom, although the others may not look all that reassuring. Similarly, with the droughts and the wildfires, if at election time we have the Martian atmosphere that we had in the last fire season, and by the way, the fire season is now the biggest season of the California year. It's very long. Then that again, just the feeling of malaise and concern, I think is some exposure for the governor. And if the economy stalls, similarly, either because of a COVID resurgence or just because it could be kind of bumpy, and that hits at the wrong time, that could hurt a governor whose message is that California is roaring back under his leadership. I list here the French Laundry problem. People are aware of the very bad misstep the governor made in going to some event at the French Laundry when everybody else was told to be in very strict lockdown. And that's such bad imagery, politically very surprising for Gavin Newsom, who I think has been careful about his image, and just a bad instinct as to what the right thing to do is. But I think that the real problem is less the French Laundry incident itself and more what it kind of like validates or exemplifies. I think that Democrats in California, there's large swaths of the state where tagging Democrats as elitists and being out of touch with the people, with the common people and their needs is a real risk. And so I think what the French Laundry thing exemplifies is something that Gavin Newsom could be tagged with. I had a friend from Great Britain who said that I'm blanking on the first name of the quarterback named Brady, the famous New England Patriot. And he said that quarterback was unpopular with a lot of American men because he was too handsome and too good at what he did. And I thought it was kind of a funny observation at the time. But I think that Gavin Newsom gets a little bit of that. He's kind of just a little bit too polished and obviously ambitious, and that puts some people off. And so that's a risk for him, depending what else is going on. And then the Employment Development Department. This is something that Gavin Newsom didn't create, this department and the bureaucracy and the problems that were exploited during the pandemic. But at some point, you own a problem, just as Trump did the pandemic. And I think that the governor is going to have to show some strong leadership and some results with respect to that department to have a good answer to people when the election season gets in. And then finally, a big risk factor is the disaffected left. If people on the left start to get the idea that they can push the governor to take strong action now on single-payer healthcare, for example, an objective that I support in terms of the goal, the policy goal. But if he gets pushed too far to do too much kind of as a condition for getting support from what should be his base, then that could be a complicating or a risk factor for the governor. And then next slide. There's two more here. One is confusion and the other is delusion. The confusion one is the ballot itself. I didn't think to put in these slides an image of the ballot from 2003, but if you remember it or if you Google it, you'll see that it's like a card that's longer than a legal length piece of paper. And up in the top left corner, there's a tiny little section printed. Do you want to be called the governor, yes or no? And there's like literally two options there. And then there's columns and columns of candidates to replace the governor. And so, the first question is the profound question, but it's just that little itty bit up in the corner. So if people miss it, minimize it, aren't careful about it, see all the other choice and decide that they don't need to fill it out or that they could pick yes, pick somebody else, then the governor could lose some votes that he might otherwise get. The delusion part is a little more about the left not supporting the governor. Anybody who thinks that this is a chance to pick a better governor for them, like a more liberal governor or anything that's not Newsom, they just don't like Newsom and they want somebody else, this is the wrong way to go about doing that. You will end up with Caitlyn Jenner or some random person who doesn't have the support that they need to get anything done or the knowledge to be governor if we're not careful. And I think Democrats are going to be consistent in their message this time to vote no on the first question. Next slide. So our work, cool thing about being a local Democratic Party, we are sort of loosely controlled by the state Democratic Party. We have a lot of ability to control the way that we pursue Democratic campaigns. We're already getting really good messaging from the recall campaign about the governor's accomplishments, the fact that it's going to be a big waste of money. It's going to cost the state a lot. So it's kind of unfortunate thing that's being inflicted on us, and all the great things that the governor wants to do, including the comeback plan. And I think that will continue. But what we do with that will be a little constrained. We'll need volunteers because we're not going to have a bunch of money. It's like an extra election cycle, both for us and for the governor. So if you're not seeing a lot of advertising yet, it's because the governor can't spend tens of millions of dollars on the recall starting now and all the way until October or November, and then still be ready to run a re-election campaign in the following year. So I think they're trying to be careful about that. And locally, we'll probably rely on volunteers to do things like email messaging, text banking, and phone banking to try to make sure people know how to fill out their ballot to say no and get that job done. So action.sccdp.org, or if you go to our homepage, sccdp.org, and go all the way off to the right side, there's a tab there. You can always kind of click there to get on the list that's really about things we do to campaign as opposed to issue things and other things. And if you do that, you'll see, if you go to that page now, you would see two opportunities. One is to phone bank into a place like Arizona or Texas or Virginia about voter suppression legislation to try to get local people there to contact their legislators. And then the other one is a partnership we have with Kings County. We're calling right now about COVID outreach. That's frankly just an excuse to call. Maybe we'll do some good and convince some people to get the vaccine, but we're also just figuring out where are the Democrats that we can reach with the information we have and get in contact with them so that we start to have the kind of conversations we need to have and the relationship we need so we can contact them later in the year and ask them to vote no on the recall, and then next year to vote for Democrats in the election. And then Jenny, if you stop to share so I can see everybody a little bit better, I'd be happy to answer any questions people have.
Thank you, Bill. I have one question for you as
Yes.
a delegate to the party convention. There was an interesting legislation that actually was the debate that was brought up by Christine Pelosi, who was the daughter of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and a convention delegate. She pushed to remove what she described as partisan language from a resolution opposing the recall of Governor Newsom, and specifically removing the word Republican partisan from that language. The vote actually was closer than you thought. With the delegates, it failed at 593 to 637. What do you think that should the Democratic Party be doing more outreach to the no party preference? Should we be looking at this as a sign that, like you said, there's a disgruntled left, that there's some issues? Because that was a pretty close vote. I mean, or should we be calling this what it is, a Republican Party power grab?
So I think that it was a close vote. First of all, there's always a lot of insider politics going on in those things. I think the one place where, a partisan statement about something like this, where you should be able to make that, is at your own party's convention, statewide convention. And so I think it was appropriate to do. And there's a difference between how the party expresses itself in a resolution and sort of the messaging and campaign strategy that's going to be pursued in the campaign. But I think more than anything, it was right because the Christine Pelosi's concern about the dark images I showed at the beginning of my slides. We hate the Republicans. It's all dark. It's all bad. We've got nothing positive to say. So we're going to focus on this deep music and this low lighting. That would be a concern if that were their plan for October. I mean, between, maybe June, July and October, November, when this election is. They're not going to win on that. They're not going to win on that to a broader audience. So I think right now, and I wish they had been more clear in articulating this to people like us who are activists in the Democratic Party and who are sophisticated enough to understand it. It's like they should have said something like, we get that people have been hurting through the pandemic and we know we're going to have to talk to them about the positive things we're going to do to meet their needs. But right now we're trying to get you all motivated to give a little money and make sure that you're all behind us on this thing, and that we get as much mileage as we can out of this January 6th rebellion thing, and the fact that Trump and the National Party, I think, really ill-advisedly stepped into this space of the recall. They should have just let it happen. But Christine Pelosi is 100% right. If this election is not about understanding that people are in pain, recognizing that the governor has made some missteps, and having the better kind of positive affirmative agenda going forward to really address the things that are of actual concern to Californians, then he won't prevail. But I think that you can see from the California roaring back stuff and the attention to homelessness in schools and infrastructure that they have started to make that pivot.
Yes, he's definitely making a dent at the local level. The city of San Jose is talking about it frequently now.
Yeah.
Michelle, you have a question?
Just to follow on that, Bill, on Helen's question, is it really a bad strategy? Because California is, 70%, between 65 and 70% Democrat. And this is a turnout election. I mean, recalls are turnout elections. So our job is to turn out Democrats. And if we turn out Democrats, we're going to win. And we can turn out Democrats. And I don't care what the Republicans do, because if we turn out Democrats, we win. I mean, just an idea. And so the best way to turn out Democrats is to say the Republicans are, the Trumpist Republicans are doing this in order to create chaos in California. And them, we hate them, vote no. Is that really a bad strategy to just say this is the Republicans in a state that's only 25 or 30% Republican?
I agree. It's not a bad strategy so much as should it be a sole strategy? And I think that the point of some of the rural delegates was, well, where I live, people, that's not going to resonate with them. I think in the Bay Area for the Santa Clara County Democratic Party, where we have 50% of registrants are Democrats, and probably another 25% are Democratic voters who are registered NPP. We definitely will get mileage from that angle. It's an undemocratic power grab, and it's funded by the national party. But I think that for a lot of Democrats, they want to be reminded why they're Democrats and why we're better than they are. And Newsom has a lot he can say about that. But the national registration, by the way, the growth in the time that I've been involved locally, 30 years almost now of Democratic politics, the growth locally and not locally so much as statewide has been in the NPP as a proportion. The Democrats have actually held their proportion. And it's a remarkable thing to look at, because the sense is that there's been less party identification. Really, there's less Republican Party identification in the state, and a lot more people who are no party preference. But the Democrats have actually kind of held our proportional share of the electorate during all of that time. So people do identify as Democrats, and I think that a strategy that reminds them, shows them that the Republicans are doing something that's kind of unfair. They're trying to do it in this off way because it's basically voter suppression, right? They're trying to do it in a special election where they pick the electorate and have an undemocratic outcome. It's just an instance of that, and there are a lot of Democrats that will respond to that.
Susan, you have a question.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Bill. It was a great presentation. A quick question. We all know that what's going to happen. We all know that if there is going to be an election, how do we get prepared when we don't know the exact date of election? We don't know what the ballot's going to be really look like, because, I'm involved in some other groups, and everyone is talking about the recall. What should we do to get ourselves ready? So when it happens, and when we know that is the date for the recall, we can at least contact the communities, our own communities, and tell them how to vote. Because the key to this election is not even to have people to get out to vote. It is to make them vote properly. I remember during Gray Davis, what happened? What huge percentage of people were voting incorrectly because they didn't know how to vote. So what is our plan, at least for Santa Clara County?
So those are all good questions. And I think that some of the uncertainty of that is what Brandon was speaking to earlier. It's that we don't really know exactly when the election is going to be. And each step of the way, there's a little bit of wiggle. And so, nobody can really say precisely what the date will be. We do know it won't be until after the summer at this point. So what we're doing locally is we're just talking to voters about other things so that we're in touch with them. We're outreach we're doing in cooperation with Kings County. That's a long-term play for the 2022 Democratic House race, in the race that TJ Cox, in the district that whatever becomes the district that TJ Cox held until 2020. And we are talking to voters. The recall hasn't really been coming up because they're probably seeing some stuff on TV, but the election is this unknown amount of time away. But we are talking about COVID vaccination. We're talking about like what's going on in their life. The next round of calls, we're establishing a good contact list with Democrats who take our call. The next round of calls will be about, okay, you should have gotten your ballot in the mail about this recall. This is exactly how you fill it out. So I think that effort will be coming soon. And it's not very satisfying. As I said, if you sign up to text message on the actual recall, no on the recall website, nothing will happen. And that's the worst thing for volunteers. So what we're trying to do with our volunteers is engage them in doing something else that we consider to be useful and also will be useful specifically to defeating the recall.
Great. All right, last question, because I'm looking at the time and we're, Karen.
Bill, Karen Fox here. Question, I'm starting to see appeals for donations. What's the right bucket to put donation money in at this time?
So I think that the Newsom campaign is raising money. There is a campaign that's called the, Newsom No on Recall kind of campaign. That website that I linked to earlier is affiliated with it. And donations to that campaign in response to their request would go directly for this purpose. It's also the case that the California State Democratic Party is kind of funding that operation right now and has an infrastructure. So they've just hired a statewide political director, and they'll be hiring some local people, eventually opening some offices. So donating to the state party would help, with the no effort, because I think that the state party will step in and spend some of its resources to fight the recall.
Great, thank you.
Great. All right. Well, with that, it's almost 5 minutes after 8. Thank you, Bill. This has been a great discussion. I wish more people would have, but you guys have this recorded, so hopefully the recording will be shared, because I think this is a really good discussion that people should be aware of. And like you said, education is key. Getting out there, being active, donating, getting involved, looking at the website when it's time. I think we will have a call to action to make sure we can do everything we can as a party, to defeat the recall. And so at this point, I will turn it back over to Jenny. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Sorry, let me get the spotlight off you, Bill. How'd that happen? Okay. Thank you so much, Brandon and Bill, for your presentations. They were fantastic. And Helen for moderating. Really, really appreciate it. Our next meeting is on June 21st, and it is on climate justice and the wildfires. We have Michael Wara, who is the Climate and Energy Policy Program and Senior Research Scholar at Woods Institute for the Environment at Stanford University. So we're looking forward to having him speak. So I hope everybody can join us then. And
Jenny, can we keep this open for a minute for people that want to chit chat a bit? If anybody does, I'm going to nerd out on the recall with Brandon for a minute. So.
Yeah, so the meeting is officially adjourned, but if anyone wants to stay and talk, you're welcome to.